trailed over yesterday about talking about cybersecurity, but I'm only going to talk about one particular bit of it. So what I'm particularly interested in this project is working with the National Security Secretariat, who are the people who own the UK's National Cyber Security Strategy. And they have the assurance function that the UK is doing what it should do in the kind of broader cyberspace. And it's kind of related to the stuff that we saw at the end of yesterday around the National Risk Assessment, the National Risk Register, and some of the risks on there. So we're looking at the top level cyber stuff here. We're not talking about Wi-Fi, open Wi-Fi in banks, or even down to hacking of individual pacemakers, because that's quite a small number of people who are affected. So we're talking about lots of people, lots of money, lots of impact. And those are the kind of risks that we're thinking about here. And I should caveat, having listened to the discussion yesterday about various arguments about the difference between risk and uncertainty, I'm going to use risk throughout the whole of this conversation. So please don't shout at me. But I do mean all of the stuff from the regular standard risk management type thing all the way up to the radical uncertainty box 3 CRUISSE type stuff, which I'm going to talk about. So talk a little bit about what the problem, the rational aims of the work, talk about what we actually did, some of the key issues and then recommendations. So this work is really about trying to influence thinking in the Cabinet Office, a bit like Ben's stuff, rather than do a kind of deep academic study of how cybersecurity works. It's really about, well, how can we do this better, and what are some of the processes and thinking and ways of thinking that Cabinet Office and the National Cybersecurity Centre should have going forwards in this space. So, what's the problem? I've just got a few headlines here. I could have chosen thousands, to be honest. It's all over the news at the moment. This one's particularly one that spikes people's interest. So this is about the Ukrainian power grid hack that happened originally in 2015, which again refers back to the presentation that we saw at the end of yesterday, something that we're concerned about, obviously. Loads of stuff going on, Russia, China, various other state actors, but also cybercrime. Those are the kind of things that we're interested in, but what exactly is one of the questions. WannaCry, the NHS and various others being hit by that, and then the increase in this kind of ransomware as these things turn from bespoke zero-day applications to kind of commoditized. And again, how do we manage that transition? Financial crime, organised crime is kind of getting big in cyberspace. There's lots of impacts there. Again, at what level does that get onto the Cabinet Office radar? That's a scary headline if anybody's ever written one. I don't know what the story underneath it exactly said, but I thought, yeah, okay, fine. That's something that people are worried about. And then one that I've been particularly interested in for a little while is we talk about the loss of data, loss of IP, etc. From big companies, but universities have got a lot of interesting IP on their systems, and how secure are they? So when I was in government, I think they connected Janet to the Chinese equivalent, and everyone was going, are you sure that's a good idea? I'm sure it is from some aspects, but from other aspects maybe not so. And then another area that's particularly of interest to me, which Ben mentioned, is Internet of Things. So you've seen some of the stories about this. A lot of these small edge devices have very limited or no cybersecurity associated with them, but they're relatively easy to hack. And then they can be used in distributed denial of service attacks, or even more of concern going forwards is the fact that they turn into actuation, so they can actually make changes in the physical world. So people can hack into things and change things in the physical world. Changes the dynamic of things. And then the last one, which I think I might have been affected by since I had a call from my bank a week or two ago, loss of personal data. At what scale is that kind of thing of interest to the government, and at what scale should it be the organisations themselves that manage it? So there's a whole broad kind of area there. And really the question is, and a lot of the discussion was around, well, how do we kind of get ahead above the parapet and stop worrying about the kind of day-to-day stuff and think about the broader system type level things that the central government needs to think about. So this is the National Cybersecurity Strategy, or the front cover of it anyway, and these are the kind of, everyone has to have a single letter and then put different words underneath it. They chose D, defend, serve, develop. But really, the focus is around life systems, stability of the economy, and UK international standing and reputation, which is quite a broad area of things to be of interest in. Personally, I did a lot of work in government on the traditional critical national infrastructure stuff, so transport networks, hospitals, power stations, all that kind of stuff. And that's part of this, of course. But then there's all these other things that come out when you talk about cyber, around this intellectual property and economic jewels, data, personal data and business data. And then the fake news has obviously been all over the news over the last few years. So media and other high threat targets, e-commerce, more and more bigger and bigger part of our economy. And then influenced by that, I mean kind of insurers and professional services and regulators and people like that. So the genesis of this project was the National Cybersecurity Strategy there, 2016-2021. It's kind of at its halfway point. So they had a bit of a halfway review. And then the question was, well, that's a 5-year strategy for a technology that's changing on a weekly, if not daily basis. So is that an appropriate tool, and how can we best manage that? Because that's government works in 5-year strategies, so what are the tools and techniques that we can use to ensure that potentially when we do the next one, or even the last half of this one, we have a more kind of approach that meets the timescales of the kind of threats that we're interested in. So, and obviously it's complex and it's evolving, and they want to know what the future's going to bring as well. So, what we did, so we worked with the National Cybersecurity Centre and the National Security Secretariat, and we ran a couple of workshops hosted by the NCSC in Victoria, looking at uncertainty and management of cyber risks. So we had some industrial partners, some academics, and as you see, a bunch of government departments came along. So the first one was looking at uncertainty and management of risks. The second one was about adaptive governance, so very much around the kind of stuff that Ben was talking about. And systems approaches of how to look at these kind of systems. It's something I have been pushing in government for a while, and it's good to see the Environment Agency here, because I know they in DEFRA are looking at systems approaches in floodplain management, which is good to see, because governments traditionally not work well at a systems level. So the fact that people are beginning to think that way is really good. So that's a kind of the mix of people who were there. There were interesting conversations that were fairly free-form, so the issues and things that came out of the meetings I kind of let grow organically rather than trying to answer specific questions. So workshop 1, I'm either surprised or worried that I'm the first person to put up the CRUISSE 3-box thing. I don't know whether that's not done anymore. So a lot of the stuff, you know, box 1, government's quite good at. A lot of the stuff that it deals with is box 2. So bits that you know, bits that are modelable, bits that are quantitative, but lots that isn't. And then the stuff that we're really interested in, particularly around systemic and emerging risk, kind of sits in the box 3 there, which is really CRUISSE type territory. So the 2 aims of this workshop were to understand the types and sources of uncertainty and cyber risk, and then look at some best practice in how cyber risk is managed out in the real world, and how that might be applicable to the National Cyber Security Strategy. So I've kind of grouped the discussion into 4 themes, which are listed there, and I'll go through some of the issues and try to pick out some of the things that are kind of CRUISSE, and hopefully there'll be some interesting stuff in there. So, understanding the risks. It's quite interesting that quite early in the conversation it became clear that the majority of cyber risks are known, have rational economic drivers, and can be predicted. Not to say they are, or they're well managed, but they're kind of firmly in that box 1. The risk evolution was seen to be driven by landmark events. So I mentioned WannaCry earlier. People knew that that kind of risk was out there, and they understood it, but they didn't do anything about it. And then it came, and then the world moved on. And you see it the same in, they drew the parallel with terrorism, with using vehicles as weapons. People knew that that was a threat and a risk, but until somebody started doing it, it didn't actually get up the priority list, and people started mitigating it. So it's a very similar kind of approach. A couple of industry guys and some of the academics actually were keen on, and the government itself, to be fair, was keen on the government to focus just on what only the government can do. So that top level stuff, there's a hierarchy of risks, there's a hierarchy of responses. We should be delegating down responses to the appropriate level, and then government should be sitting only at the top, looking at across particularly systems level effects. So I mentioned to somebody at coffee yesterday about, for example, in the financial system, a bank might have an optimal mitigation strategy for a cyber risk, which is great for them, but is suboptimal from a systems level. Who's sitting there saying, actually, no, we need to have a better system level approach to this rather than just your individual approach? Follow the pain was quite an interesting one that came out of one of the industry guys about how you work out who's the person who's responsible. Who's it going to hit? Where's the financial pain going to live in the system? And those are the people who are really most concerned about this. And then there were a number of threes. Three seem to be the number of the day. And then there's three risk model, kind of very much, that came from KPMG, and it very much sits in parallel with the kind of CRUISSE stuff. So zone of routine, box one type stuff. Zone of surprises, we kind of know it. It's understandable, but we haven't necessarily planned for it. Box two, zone of catastrophe, stuff that's outside our kind of imagination and we haven't thought about before. Very much box three. Risk framework stuff, basically, there's nothing out there, there's nothing off the shelf. As I said, there's a whole hierarchy of risks from component to system level that need to be managed. There's this discussion about what kind of level of abstraction does government need to look at this risk. Is cyber actually the risk, or is it just a vector for another risk? And should they be thinking about the outcomes and the impacts? So if we think about the shutdown of the national grid yesterday, does that matter whether that was a cyber or whether that was a terrorist attack or whether that was a natural event? From a resilience perspective, possibly not. There was a lot of discussion around the culture, so there's a lot of techies involved in this. Cyber risk people tend to be techies, who like techie. But then that means there's a preponderance to look at the component risk rather than the system risk, and there's a big communication issue, which is one of the other things that we'll talk about. Metrics, government-like metrics. I think the original request from the Cabinet Office is what metrics can we use to make sure that this cybersecurity strategy is working well. Very difficult to define. Metrics are dependent on what you're measuring. Are you measuring the right thing? Do you define your metrics on what you can measure, or do you define your measurements on what you actually want to know? And bad metrics can lead to bad behaviours and bad incentives, which you see in a lot of areas. And there was a discussion around more mature domains. I think Lenny mentioned safety yesterday. Been a lot of work at systems level in the kind of safety space. Public health was an interesting one, because there's the balance between kind of individual health outcomes plus the kind of public health broader societal level outcomes, which is an interesting balance between the kind of component and system level risk that you see in front of them. Complexity. I mentioned that people didn't think, the perception is most of these risks fall in box 3, but they don't. Not just the current risk, but the risk trajectories are quite well known and well understood. But the ones in box 2 and 3 are the ones that government needs to think about. And it was interesting, particularly in the second workshop where we talked about scenarios and people talked about failure of imagination and talked about credibility of these scenarios. It was very difficult to come up with kind of credible discussions around scenarios in this space. And the key thing, I think, here is around the complex nature of the system of systems, the phrase that Ben used, that cyber is, which leads to emerging risk, it leads to system risk, it leads to compound risk, it leads to cascading risks. And who's responsible for those for managing those kind of risks? People don't tend to, certainly lower down the levels, people are much more concerned on their immediate risk mitigation. So that's a role for government potentially. Unintended consequences always need to consider those. And then it was interesting to see that nobody from the government side really knew what the balance of drivers in the national security strategy were. You saw those 3 Ds that I put up, but what's the balance between them? Because sometimes they're quite contradictory or they push against each other. So defining, okay, we're more interested in security in this space than we are prosperity, or vice versa, is really important to be able to then set the metrics and understand whether you're meeting your goals. Communication, big in this space, which is, I think, very CRUISSE-like, or one of the areas where CRUISSE has got a lot to offer. And it's not just, so there was a whole bunch of stuff here around NCSC trying to communicate to the public and to SMEs and to businesses, which we try to kind of move away from, because we're looking at more the communication to ministers and senior policymakers in government, which is also problematic. There's a whole challenge there, and I think one of the issues in government particularly is we have the RAG system, so the red, amber, green, likelihood, impact, or kind of standard risk approach really doesn't work in these complex systems. But if you move too far away from that, then people aren't going to understand what you're talking about. And I think the National Cybersecurity Centre have had problems trying to come up with new ways of communicating to policymakers how cyber is different from some of the other risks. So that was one thing that was quite interesting, and we did some work, kind of side work on that, coming up with trying to compress down the 10 dimensions of cyber risk into kind of 3, so at least you can draw it, which is having a little bit of traction with the Cabinet Office. And then one of the problems often in this space, which goes back to that cultural thing and technology-driven kind of bottom-up, is people talking too complex about this stuff. You need simple solutions to simple problems explained in simple ways, and that will help some of the communication stuff. And then we talked about subjectivity and emotions on the deficiencies and the lack of data, which again is very crucial. So workshop 2. So this is more about adaptive management. So this was trying to move the debate on to, well, what can we do about this stuff and what's out there. The aims there to talk about adaptive management and see whether there's anything that actually can help NSS either with this cyber strategy or the next one. We talked a lot about IRGC, the International Risk Governance Council work that's happened over the last few years. Are you involved with that? Okay. So a couple of the people on the panel were involved with that. And they've done some really interesting work over the last few years, which is kind of right in the sweet spot of this stuff. So it's about emerging risk, it's about catastrophic risk, it's about system risk. And they don't give you an answer, but they talk about a lot of ways of trying to manage this, and it's all very adaptive. So there's a kind of a 2-line description of what adaptive management is there. It's really just about continuously monitoring and then learning and being flexible. So not locking yourself into solutions, which a 5-year strategy tends to lock you into solutions. So just to give you an idea of what's in those documents, they're very dense, which is one of their problems. 100 pages each, which is a bit difficult for policymakers to read. There's 2 here, one on systemic, one on emerging, there's 7 on one and 5 on the other, but they're basically the same things. So it's all about, well, work out what your system is, work out your scenarios, work out what you want to try and achieve, get your strategies, find the barriers and address them, which is a big thing in cyber about addressing barriers, to very similar to the stuff that Ben spoke about, and then learn, adapt and review. So we spoke a lot around these things, and I think a lot of the stuff that came out of relevance to cyber, if you look at cyber systems, they're complex systems of systems with interlinkage of risk, costs and benefits, which don't always live in the same places. They're socio-technical or socio-technical economic risks. They're not just technical, and they're subject to very rapid technology change. And all of those things are kind of aspects of risks that those reports deal with. When we spoke about it, we talked specifically around air pollution in the US, floods in the Netherlands, in Holland, and transport safety in the US, where some of these adaptive approaches have been applied. Arthur Peterson, who was here for dinner yesterday, who's here at UCL, was one of the people there who's been involved in a bunch of this stuff, and in IRGC stuff, and was talking about some of this. And one of the key things that came out of it, and one of the key recommendations in some of these reports, is about this thing called a risk conductor, which that kind of diagram on this side, on the right side to you, tries to explain a little bit. But it's very similar to the role that Cabinet Office are trying to do at the moment, but kind of expanded a bit. So Cabinet Office kind of sit in the middle, they kind of hold the reins, they make sure everybody's doing stuff. If they see gaps, they do task and finish activities to try and address those gaps and then pass it back on to the most responsible person. But this is a bit more complicated than that and a bit more in depth. And these are people who kind of sit there and understand the system and look at the system as a whole and look at those emerging and systemic risks and put things in place to address them and understand them better. So I think one of the major recommendations that I made kind of inside to the Cabinet Office is really this is where they should be moving to. in this space particularly, and you can see it potentially in some of the other ones as well. And it doesn't have to be a big resource, it's just a couple of people whose job that is, but with some resource behind them, particularly money, which is one of the recommendations. Because I don't know, I think I had the number up at the front there of how much money is in the National Cybersecurity Strategy this time around, about £2 billion. But that's usually given away in big chunks to Ministry of Defence or GCHQ or wherever else. And one of the problems in government, which I've said to a few people today and yesterday, is government's really bad at spending money to work out how to spend money. So it should have a little pot of money that said, oh, there's something happening, we're seeing signals of some emerging threat or some new systems threat, let's go and pay somebody or give the resource to somebody to go and work out whether that is something we need to begin thinking about and exactly what it is. And then this kind of reflexive bit of the periodically review at the right kind of timescales, because a lot of the timescales that government work out, which is usually annual or biennial, doesn't work signed up. Some of the key issues across both workshops are on the slide, and then some of the recommendations on the next one. So, majority box one. So, but one of the key points is, well, let's work out what is box one, and let's move that over to the people who manage box one, so we can concentrate on the stuff that we need to concentrate on, which is really around, as I said, the systemic emergent compound risks. The stuff in the National Risk Assessment at the moment is pretty good, actually. The NRA process is held up as one of the best in the world from a government risk perspective. I've been heavily involved with it over the last few years. They actually let me see the new one because it's a bit classified. But there's no cyber risk in that, or nothing of any consequence. They really can't get their head around how to fold cyber risks into that process, because it doesn't work in with how the NRA runs at the moment. A lot of it about the rapid change of evolution technology, and this difficulty in understanding the level of abstraction that they need to be thinking about. Because are they thinking about particular attack vectors? Are they thinking about actors? Are they thinking about intent? What are the drivers that they need to be thinking about? Which then goes to the next point, which is kind of what we're talking about this comparison and prioritisation. I was going to put that cost-benefit analysis doesn't work in the presentation, but I don't think I did. But I will say it. There was a lot of discussion about CBA and the fact that it's really difficult in this space. So, as I say, resilience is another area. There's a whole bunch of areas where CBA is difficult to apply. But this one particularly, so the Cabinet Office has a limited capacity, limited bandwidth, limited resources. Should it be thinking about floods? Should it be thinking about shutdown of the national grid? Should it be thinking about IP threat from UK industry? How can it balance and prioritise those relative risks? No clear overarching risk management program, unfortunately, is something you can take off the shelf. And I've talked about metrics. I've talked about the fact that they seem to be complex, but they're not. The fact that they're rational economic drivers is quite interesting, but that means you need to look at them from a socio-technical perspective, not just from a technical perspective, which is where people tend to. But the ones that are new, the emerging stuff, needs new thinking. So I think the narrative approach that we talked about in the meetings went down very well. Because as I say, they're struggling with scenario approaches to some of this stuff. So taking it to the next level, I think, is of interest. But having the right people in the room to have those conversations, because they tend to either be very technical or policy. You need a whole broad range of experts here. And then there was a lot of in-the-weeds stuff about metrics, which was kind of interesting, but not quite where we're going with this project. So recommendations. So the idea here is, as I said, Cabinet Office are thinking right now about what they do. So it's a great time to have some influence into that thinking. And as we've seen from Ben and from EA and from a whole bunch of other people, particularly Cabinet Office, are interested in thinking through some of the stuff. They've realised what they do at the moment doesn't necessarily work that well or could be work better, and they're open to new ideas on how to do this. I'm looking at Cabinet Office there and hoping I'm not saying too much wrong. So looking at expanding scenario planning, red teaming particularly was seen as interesting. I don't know whether you've ever done any of that, but it's great fun. And if you get the right people in the room, you can come up with some really interesting, weird and wacky things. I did it about trying to break the Olympics. and we had some interesting people in the room, and they came up with ways of attacking the Olympics that thankfully the bad guys never thought about. But it allows you to think outside of the box, particularly if you get, as I say, people who aren't actually in this space. So you don't just get cyber people, you get people from other areas. And how about doing now? And then the other thing is and it kind of goes back to the looking at this from the broader perspective. There's a lot of active motivation stuff here about understanding what are viable and plausible scenarios. There's motivations around money, of course, but then obviously when you get to a state actor, there's other motivations, and I'm trying to understand what the actors' motivations and drivers are, rather than just what the technology will allow. So it might be possible to do something, but would anybody do it? That's kind of the question there. As I said, this risk conductor, improved coordination at the centre, which I think is important. There was some interesting stuff which kind of comes back to Ben's point about lessons learned. Government's really good at collecting lessons learned. You always do a lessons learned thing afterwards, and you have this big spreadsheet, and then it just sits on a computer somewhere. I think that's not just government, I think lots of places are like that. But what was interesting was, say, for WannaCry, there were some lessons learned, but there were lessons learned for the NHS responding to that kind of attack. Where there are lots of lessons that could have been learned either across other sectors or for different types of attacks that had the same kind of characteristics. And then the other thing is about trying to get the information at weak signals of emerging threats through data. So there's lots of data collected. It's not particularly consistently analysed. So it's kind of done on an ad hoc basis, and they recognise that there needs to be more of a strategy about that. But then a lot of the stuff, and the transport thing is where a lot of this comes in, is about reporting mechanisms for incidents and near misses. And how can you get that reporting mechanism? I mean, they do for incidents, but do people really report it? Are the reporting structures quite right? As I say, I had my bank say, we think there's been some fraudulent activity on your accounts. There had been, they cancelled it and refunded me the money. And as far as I'm aware, that's kind of where it ended. So did they have to report it into the central or not? Did I? I didn't report it into the central, should I have done? So there's a lot of kind of thresholds when people report stuff and or don't report stuff, and are those thresholds in the right place? And then the near misses are also really important, and people don't report those. There's no mechanism or reason to report those. There's a number of different bits of legislation and regulation that require people to report, but they report to different people, different areas, different formats, and there's no kind of coherence in it all. So bringing that all together is a great source of information and needs to be done more. Horizon scanning technology watched in a more systematic manner, that kind of goes back here, that's kind of the same thing. I've talked about small amounts of funding for rapid response to new stuff, which hopefully will work. They seem to be quite keen on that. And then I mentioned understanding the outcomes. Government response to only to the risks that they can mitigate, and these kind of needing someone to look at the high-level systemic stuff. Time up. Okay. So that's it really. So the key point here is trying to, it's a slow process trying to get government to think differently about some of this stuff. There's an interesting point of influence now because of the timing of this. And my understanding of there was a few people in the room that were in the workshops. There seemed to be a lot of engagement, and you saw from the number of government departments that attended, there's a lot of interest and engagement in this space. So I think they realised that, so the NCSC was set up with this new cybersecurity strategy, so it's kind of new, and there's a consolidation of lots of pre-existing things that lived all around different bits of government. So they're still trying to find their feet and understand their role and understand what their capacity should be. And Cabinet Office is sitting there at the top saying, well, how do we assure all this stuff? And I think, and this hasn't been very CRUISSE-y, but what I've been trying to do as an ex-policy person is trying to influence into the policy space. And I think there's lots of things that CRUISSE can bring to this debate that will be of value. So anyway, I'll leave it there. That's me. Yeah, happy to take questions.